This is Liz Franzel with Crawford Media Group in Denver, and today our guest is Sherry Few. Sherry is the president and founder of United States Parents Involved in Education, also known as USPI. We'll be talking about lies being taught in our schools that threaten freedom and harm children, also about men's participation in women's sports. Welcome to our program, Sherry.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate you having me on.
Sherry, tell us about what led you to start your organization and about your mission.
Well, when my children were in school, and I'm dating myself a little bit here because they're in their mid-30s, I started an organization in South Carolina, the state where I live, and it was called South Carolina Parents Involved in Education. I was very concerned about what I saw in my children's curriculum, things that weren't true that they were being taught, and really a very sort of liberal perspective on things like history and even world geography. There was insidious sex education. So that's why I started the organization. And then in 2010, we led the fight against the Common Core standards in our state, and many states had the same activity happening. And it ended up in just having the Common Core standards rebranded. They were just put back out under a different name. Mm-hmm. So I started speaking with colleagues around the country that had the same experience in their state, and that's when we formed the national organization, United States Parents Involved in Education, with the mission to close the U.S. Department of Education and end all federal education mandates. And the reason we chose that as our mission is we understood that that's where the majority of the nefarious pedagogies originate, the pedagogies like Common Core, and they're incentivized with federal dollars. So that's the reason we chose that as our mission, and we're working really hard even today with a new focus of encouraging states to wean themselves off federal funding.
So what kind of things are you talking about when you say some of the things you are seeing in the schools?
Well, there is a myriad of things. It is a shame that we have to explain so many different things that are happening that are basically lies that children are being taught. And that's why we produced the film about a year and a half ago. It's titled Truth and Lies in American Education. And the film goes through all of these different issues, the sexualization of children that's starting at very young ages. And we know that's imploded into this whole transgender ideology. Children being given drugs and counseled behind their parents' backs to try to transfer into a sex that is contrary to their biological sex. So we have that happening, and we have the critical Marxist theories that are happening, and they fall under an umbrella called culturally relevant pedagogy, where it sets up groups of oppressors and those who are oppressed, pitting people groups against one another. And then we have the blatantly false history, things like the 1619 Project. So there are so many things, and the film goes into all of that. I encourage your listeners to check out our film. It can be found at truthandliesfilm.us. So that's what we're looking at. That's the battleground, and it just seems to be getting worse every day.
What exactly, you mentioned the 1619 Project. Could you fill me in on that?
Sure.
Or a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So there was something that was written. It came out of the New York Times, and the liberal educators went running with it. So it's trying to suggest that our country was not founded in 1776, but rather in 1619, when they claimed the first black slaves arrived in our country. And so they're trying to even change history, liberally change history as far as the founding of this country. And, of course, the whole premise, as you can imagine, is about the fact that our country is systemically racist, white privilege, and all of that nonsense that you hear so much about today.
Yeah. Touch a little bit on the transgender thing. How much transgender influence is there in our government school system?
It is far more than you could imagine. And the sad part about it is, again, it's often behind parents' backs. And we're seeing report after report of school districts around the country, even in states like Arizona, where you wouldn't think something like this is happening. I was actually reading an article this morning about a school board in Arizona where they created some new transgender policies, and parents had gone to the school board and complained about it. And the school board president, they threatened to come back with more people because they were ignoring them. Mm-hmm. And the school board president responded, "Bring it on. Like it was a battle. We're going to do this. We don't even care what you think." Wow. So the schools are taking over parenting, if you will, mm-hmm. taking over topics that should be left to the home. They've totally neglected what I believe is their mission is to teach children to read, write, and do math. And they've thrown all of that out and replaced it with these very harmful ideologies. You can imagine how harmful it is for a young child to be groomed into believing they're a sex contrary to their biological sex, and even encouraged to take hormone blockers that causes permanent brain development issues. And then in some instances, they are even convinced to mutilate their own bodies.
Yeah, it is pretty scary. We're visiting with Sheri Few, founder and president of United States Parents Involved in Education. And we've been talking about the corruption in our schools and about the men in women's sports issue that we are going to start right now. So, Sheri, touch on that. Tell us what's going on in sports today. Not, we've heard about it, but let's talk about it.
Yes, so there are many states that have actually implemented laws. They've passed laws that will protect women's sports, keeping men out. So these quote-unquote transgender women, they're actually men who mm-hmm. are competing in women's sports. We have seen on the news several incidents in different areas where these men have competed and won and kept women from being able to compete in their own sport. So you're probably familiar with Title IX. It's been around for 50 years. It was a federal law that was created to protect women's sports. So the thing was, 50 years ago, when they had the need for the law, was that most funding and emphasis and all resources were targeted toward men's sports and very little for women's sports. So to level the playing field, this law was created to protect women's sports. So now, with the irony of the fact of it being created for that purpose, now the Biden administration is creating new regulations. After 50 years, they're creating new regulations that is going to turn the law on its head, because what they're doing with these new regulations is suggesting that if we don't allow men to compete in women's sports, somehow we're harming those men, that we would harm them in ways that are just ridiculous to think about, because mm-hmm. I believe the real harm is what's being done to young children. Yeah. And now the federal government is seeking to codify the ability for adults to continue to harm children in this way through new regulations coming out through Title IX.
Well, not only that, I mean, think about the women who have worked so hard to be in sports and to, let's talk about the Olympics, right? And how hard they worked. And here comes this guy who's still a guy, whether he changes his name or, puts some mascara on, whatever. And not only can they be physically harmed if it's a contact sport, but it just defeats all the work that these women have trained for.
Oh, yes, it is. And that's why it is so contrary to the Title IX law to change it this way, because that was the whole goal, was for women to have a fair ability to compete. And now allowing men to compete in their sports is not, it's the opposite, has the absolute opposite effect. So, yes, you're right. Women can be harmed. We saw that in one of the hockey games a few months back mm-hmm. when a male athlete masquerading as a transgender female knocked the teeth out of a young girl. And so they can be harmed physically because mm-hmm. obviously men are typically built stronger than women.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the competition. When men and women are different. Our bodies are built different. Even our hips as women are different because of childbearing.
Right.
So that affects running and all sorts of things related to sports. So it puts women at an unfair disadvantage, and it's pretty simple to me. Men are men and women are women. That's a scientific fact. And so allowing this liberal ideology to come in and destroy women's sports is wrong, it's unfair, and it should be outlawed, as it has been in many states. But then we've got this Title IX coming in with regulations, which will, federal law, trump state law. So that's why, we get back to the mission of U.S. PIE. U.S. PIE is encouraging states not to take federal funding, because the only way this regulation with Title IX will supersede the state laws banning men and women's sports is if the state receives federal funding. Mm. So if they wean themselves off federal funding, they can ignore these regulations and their laws remain intact and women's sports are protected.
So if they don't take the federal funding, what does it look like for the state? Is there enough funding to help schools and whatnot on its own?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And that's one of the facts we're trying to get out to people, is that on average, each state only receives about 10% of their education budget from the federal government. Mm. So that could be a lot in dollars, but percentage-wise, it's minimal. And so we've published a blueprint called the Blueprint to Restore State Control of Education. And in this blueprint, we give 4 steps that states can take in order to wean themselves off federal funding. And the second step, after you've analyzed, all your different funding sources, is to do a cost of compliance study. So that 10% that the state receives, they may learn that it costs them 3 or 4% to comply with the federal regulations. In fact, these new Title IX regulations are anticipated to cost at least $24 million for the states. So if you take what it costs to comply with the regulations, states may see that maybe they're only receiving, a total benefit of 5 or 6% of their education budget. And that's something that is feasible for them to wean themselves off of and create their own programs in place of the federal programs.
And what's interesting is that's something that I think probably flies under the radar, doesn't it? It's like, that's not a real, what you just stated, those facts, really isn't public information, I don't think. Otherwise, I don't know. I think a lot of people, after hearing, this conversation, your cause, they're going to say, wait a minute, what are we, why are we allowing them to infiltrate and to dictate what we do just because we get a few dollars from them, right?
That's exactly right. And that's why we're trying to get the information out as far and as wide as possible. A lot of people also assume that, the U.S. Department of Education has been around, forever. Well, it was only created in 1980. And several presidents have said they would get rid of it when they were candidates for office. Ronald Reagan was one, but he didn't do it. It's a shame that they didn't follow through earlier and put a stop to this, because it just keeps growing. It's up in the billions of dollars now, their annual budget on the federal level. So taxpayers are funding this very system that is destroying government schools and taking away local and parental control of education.
Sherry, as we get to the end of our interview, tell our listeners where they can go to learn more about these issues, but also about your organization.
All right, they can go to our website. It's USPIE, that's uspie.org. We have some great resources there for parents. If they look under the media tab, I've written several opinion editorials on all of these topics, some really good information there. And, of course, then there's our film. It's truthandliesfilm.us, so they can access it directly from that website or from the US PIE website. So I encourage your listeners to view the film, and I give permission to anyone who purchases a DVD to use it in a wide audience. They can have a viewing at a local theater, however they want to use it. There's no licensing fee, because we're not We did not produce the film to make money. We want the information out there, again, as far and as wide as possible.
Sherry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Liz.